In this video, let us learn about the various sulci and gyri of cerebral hemispheres. We have already noted in the previous video that surface of the cerebral cortex undergoes extensive folding to increase the surface area. Now this is what is going to result in multiple surface depressions known as sulci and elevations known as gyri. Sulci are variably classified. Based upon development, they are classified as primary sulci, which develop independently or they are genetically programmed, or into secondary sulci. These develop based upon some other factors. Two such secondary sulci are, one is the lateral sulcus. The whole lateral sulcus, that is stem of the lateral sulcus and its three rami, it develops because when the cerebral hemispheres will be developing, the portion which is going to form insula, that area grows much slowly compared to the surrounding areas. So the surrounding areas grow faster and they overhang on the area which is going to form the insula, getting it buried in the depth. Now because of this overhanging surrounding areas, that the lateral sulcus develops. So this is a secondary sulcus developing due to the difference in the growth rate of the area which is going to form insula and the surrounding cortex. Similarly, we have parieto-occipital sulcus. This is also secondary because the posterior part of the corpus callosum known as splenium, the fibers of this splenium will be arching backwards. Now that is what results in the formation of parieto-occipital sulcus at the junction between parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. So lateral sulcus and parieto-occipital sulcus, because they are developing secondary to some other external factor, they are called as secondary sulci. The rest of the sulci are primary sulci. Sulci can also be classified based upon their depth. They are either classified as complete sulci when they reach all the way to the depth of the ventricles, wherein they even indent on the surface of the ventricle. Two classical examples are the calcarine sulcus, which forms the calcar avis in the posterior limb of the lateral ventricle, and collateral sulcus, which forms collateral trigone in the floor of the lateral ventricle at the junction between the central part, inferior limb and the posterior limb. Now all other sulci are called as incomplete sulci because they have variable depths and none of them reach the surface of the ventricles. Sulci can also be classified based upon their relation to functional areas into limiting sulcus. Now limiting sulcus separates two separate functional areas. So one of the functional area is in front of it, another is behind it. The classic example for that is the central sulcus, which has the precentral gyrus, which is a motor area in front of it, and postcentral gyrus, which is a sensory area behind it. So classic example for limiting sulcus is the central sulcus. Yet another example is the anterior part of the calcarine sulcus. The second type of sulcus is the axial sulcus. Here a functional area grows along the axis of the sulcus. Now this is seen in case of posterior part of the calcarine sulcus, wherein the area number 17 grows along the axis of calcarine sulcus. It will be in the depth as well as on both its lips. The third type of sulcus is the operculated sulcus, wherein the one functional area will be along the depth of the sulcus and the two lips of the sulcus will have two separate functional areas. Now this is seen in case of lunate sulcus on the superolateral surface. So within the depth of the lunate sulcus, we have area number 18 growing, that is the parastriate area. And on the posterior lip, we have the area number 17 or the striate cortex. And on the anterior lip, we have the peristriate area or the area number 19. So three functional areas associated with the sulcus, that's a operculated sulcus. So sulci are classified based on the development as primary or secondary, based upon the depth as complete or incomplete, and based upon their relation to functional areas into limiting sulci, axial sulci and operculated sulci. Now coming to the sulci gyri seen on the superolateral surface, please practice drawing this diagram. Now this is the outline of cerebral cortex. Please make sure that the outline is in a zigzag line, not a straight line, because it represents presence of multiple sulci and gyri, which is an indication of an intelligence of the species. So do not make a straight lined outline. Now The first sulcus we notice on this surface is the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. Now this runs backwards and upwards, starting from just above the temporal pole. It runs for a distance of about 7 to 8 centimeters, and its posterior end is slightly upturned. The second prominent sulcus seen on this surface is the central sulcus of Rolando. Now if you see the superomedial border, about 1 centimeter behind the midpoint will be the beginning of this central sulcus. This sulcus runs downwards and forwards for a distance of about 8 to 10 centimeters, making an angle of about 70 degrees with the superomedial border. However, the lower end of the sulcus will not touch the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. You will have to practice drawing these sulci. Now coming to the sulci gyri present on the frontal lobe. Running anterior to the central sulcus, parallel to it, is the precentral sulcus. So the gyrus between central sulcus and precentral sulcus is the precentral gyrus. Now the rest of the frontal lobe in front of the precentral sulcus is divided into 3 parts by 2 horizontally running sulci. They are the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus. Now these 2 sulci will divide the area into superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus and inferior frontal gyrus. It's a very simple thing. It doesn't really take a very high intelligence to know these sulci and gyri. Now within the inferior frontal gyrus, we have already seen posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus has 2 more rami, that is branches. They are the anterior horizontal ramus and anterior ascending ramus. These 2 rami will also be seen within the inferior frontal gyrus. Now these 3 rami of lateral sulcus will divide this area into 3 parts. The part below the anterior horizontal ramus is the pars orbitalis. Part between the horizontal and ascending rami is the pars triangularis, and the part between the ascending and the posterior rami is the pars opercularis. So these are the various sulci and gyri within the or on the superolateral surface in the frontal lobe. Now coming to the temporal lobe. Now the temporal lobe is divided by 2 sulci, superior and inferior temporal sulci, into 3 gyrus. Superior temporal gyrus, middle temporal gyrus and inferior temporal gyrus. All that you need to note here is both middle and inferior temporal gyri also, at their posterior ends, they are upturned, just like the posterior ramus of lateral sulcus. Now coming to the parietal lobe. Running parallel and posterior to the central sulcus of Rolando, we have postcentral sulcus. So the area between central sulcus and postcentral sulcus is the postcentral gyrus. Now the rest of the parietal lobe is divided into 2 parts by horizontally running flower bracket shaped intraparietal sulcus. Now this intraparietal sulcus will divide the area into superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule. Please note, we are not using the word gyrus here. Now within this inferior parietal lobule, we have the upturned end of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus. So the gyrus around that is the supramarginal gyrus. Similarly, we have the upturned end of the superior temporal sulcus. The gyrus around that sulcus is the angular gyrus. And similar gyrus around the inferior temporal sulcus is known as arcus temporo-occipitalis. So these are the sulci and gyri in the parietal lobe. That is postcentral sulcus marking postcentral gyrus, then the intraparietal sulcus separating superior parietal lobule from the inferior parietal lobule. Within the inferior parietal lobule, we have supramarginal gyrus around the upturned posterior end of posterior ramus of lateral sulcus, angular gyrus behind that around the upturned end of the superior temporal sulcus, and arcus temporo-occipitalis around the upturned posterior end of the inferior temporal sulcus. Now coming to the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe is separated from the occipital lobe by parieto-occipital sulcus. Now this is a prominent sulcus on the medial surface, but we see a small part of it on the superolateral surface. Now running behind and parallel to this parieto-occipital sulcus within the occipital lobe, we have the transverse sulcus. You will notice that the intraparietal sulcus is almost touching the midpoint of the transverse sulcus. Now close to the occipital pole, we see the terminal part of the calcarine sulcus. Before we go there, we are seeing the arcus parieto-occipitalis is the gyrus around the parieto-occipital sulcus. Now, as I was saying, close to the posterior occipital pole, we see the posterior end of the calcarine sulcus. Again, calcarine sulcus is best seen on the medial surface. Quite often, it may not even extend onto the superolateral surface, but sometimes the posterior end of it will extend onto the superolateral surface. So we see a small part of calcarine sulcus close to the occipital pole. Anterior to this calcarine sulcus, running vertically, we have what is known as lunate sulcus. The two ends of this lunate sulcus is limited by superior and inferior polar sulci. Now, anterior to this lunate sulcus, running horizontally, we have the lateral occipital sulcus, which divides this rest of the occipital lobe into a superior and inferior occipital gyri. Now, the area between lunate sulcus and the lateral occipital sulcus is named as gyrus descendens. So these are the various sulci and gyri on the superolateral surface. Please practice drawing this diagram. And also, you are supposed to identify these sulci in the specimen of cerebral hemisphere. Now, moving on to the medial surface. This is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, where we are seeing the cut section of corpus callosum. Arching below that is another fiber bundle known as fornix. Now, between the corpus callosum and fornix, that area will be covered by a sheet of white and grey matter known as septum pellucidum. Below and behind the fornix and corpus callosum, we have the diencephalon, upper part of which is thalamus and lower part of which is the hypothalamus. We will go into those details at a later stage. So now coming to the various sulci and gyri on the medial surface. Arching just above the corpus callosum, we have the callosal sulcus. Now the area below the anterior part of the corpus callosum is known as subcallosal area. A sulcus starts from this subcallosal area, runs parallel to the callosal sulcus, and again its posterior end runs upwards to meet the superomedial margin. Now this is the cingulate sulcus. Now the area between callosal sulcus and cingulate sulcus is the cingulate gyrus. On the medial surface, just in front of this upturned cingulate sulcus posterior end, we see the medial ends of central sulcus, precentral sulcus and the postcentral sulcus. So between these three sulci, we have a part of precentral gyrus and postcentral gyrus. Now that area is what we call as paracentral lobule. Now the rest of the area in front of the precentral sulcus, above the cingulate sulcus, will be the medial frontal gyrus. So that extends all the way to the frontal pole. Now coming to the remaining portions, two prominent sulci seen on the posterior aspect are, one is the parieto-occipital sulcus. As I told you, this sulcus is better seen on the medial surface. So it is running just from behind the posterior end of the corpus callosum, running upwards. It separates the parietal lobe in front and the occipital lobe behind. And one more sulcus, which is again prominent in the posterior surface, posterior part of the medial surface, is the calcarine sulcus, running almost horizontally. From the occipital pole, it runs forwards to meet the parieto-occipital sulcus. Now, between these two sulci, we have three areas now. Behind the cingulate sulcus and in front of the parieto-occipital sulcus, we have precuneus. Enclosed within the wedge-shaped area between the parieto-occipital sulcus and calcarine sulcus, we have cuneus. And the area below the calcarine sulcus is known as lingual gyrus. Now, rest of the area below the diencephalon is actually the tentorial surface or the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, this area is separated into three parts by means of two longitudinally running sulci, more medial collateral sulcus and lateral occipitotemporal sulcus. The name is occipitotemporal sulcus because posterior part of this lobe belongs to occipital lobe and the anterior part belongs to temporal lobe. So these two sulci will divide the area into three gyri. The medial gyrus is the parahippocampal gyrus. The remaining two are the medial and lateral occipitotemporal gyri. Now, cingulate gyrus is connected to the parahippocampal gyrus behind the corpus callosum by means of isthmus. That's the small portion of the gyrus which is present, connecting cingulate gyrus above and the parahippocampal gyrus below. Now, within the parahippocampal gyrus, a small sulcus is seen known as rhinal sulcus. This separates the uncus from the rest of the parahippocampal gyrus. So, these are the various sulci and gyri on the medial surface. Now, coming to the inferior surface, few things which we see here is the cut section of the brainstem with the extending cerebral peduncles. We are seeing the optic nerve, optic chiasma, and the two optic tracts on either side. On the inferior surface, anteriorly, we also see the optic or the olfactory bulbs, which are the rounded terminal endings in the anterior end of this area, and then which is continuing posteriorly into a fiber bundle known as olfactory tract, which flattens out in the posterior end to form the olfactory trigone, where it divides, the tract divides into olfactory striae. Usually we see medial and lateral striae. Sometimes we may also see a very tiny intermediate stria. Immediately behind this olfactory striae and olfactory trigone, we have what is known as anterior perforated substance. That is the area where the surface will be perforated by multiple striate branches, both of anterior and middle cerebral arteries. So these are the landmarks which has got nothing to do with sulci and gyri on the surface, but we need to identify them on the inferior surface. Now let us start with the sulci and gyri. Now, starting from this anterior perforated substance, running laterally, we have the stem of the lateral sulcus. Now this is the first sulcus we notice. So if you notice the inferior surface, it will be at two levels. The anterior portion, which is at a much higher level, that is the orbital part of the inferior surface. The posterior part, which is at a lower level, that is the tentorial part of the inferior surface. Now these two parts are separated by this stem of the lateral sulcus. The stem of the lateral sulcus starts from this anterior perforated substance medially, runs towards the lateral end, where when it reaches the superolateral surface, there this stem will divide into three rami, which we have seen earlier: a posterior ramus, anterior horizontal ramus, and anterior ascending ramus. Typical tree structure. This is the stem dividing into three branches. Now coming to other sulci and gyri, let's first start with the orbital surface. Along the length of the olfactory tract, we have the olfactory sulcus. So if you remove the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract, we see a sulcus deep to that. That is the olfactory sulcus, which separates an area medial to it. That area medial to it is the gyrus rectus. The rest of the lateral area is divided by an edge-shaped orbital sulcus into an anterior, posterior, lateral and medial orbital gyri. Now this is what constitutes what we call as orbitofrontal cortex. Now coming to the tentorial surface, we know that the tentorial surface is marked by two anteroposteriorly running sulci. We have seen it on the medial surface aspect also. The medial sulcus is the collateral sulcus, which was classified as a complete sulcus because it reaches the depth of the lateral ventricle, and the lateral sulcus is the occipitotemporal sulcus. So these two sulci will divide the area into three gyri. The medial gyrus is the parahippocampal gyrus, then we have medial occipitotemporal gyrus, and then we have lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. Now lateral occipitotemporal gyrus is also known as fusiform gyrus, an area important in recognizing the faces. Then we know that within the parahippocampal gyrus, we have rhinal sulcus, which separates the uncus. So these are the sulci and gyri on the inferior surface. Again, practice the diagram as well as identify the sulci on the surface of the cerebral hemisphere specimen. Now Brodmann has numbered various areas based on the cytoarchitecture. Some of the numbers at least we have to remember. I have marked them, the areas were has been marked with this blue color. You will notice that none of these areas are actually going along with the the surface sulci and gyri. But different areas have different cytoarchitectonic design. That is how the Brodmann has given the numbers. So let us start identifying them on the superolateral surface here. Within the postcentral gyrus, I'm actually going in a numerical order just to make it easy for you to remember. So let's start with the postcentral gyrus. The central part of the postcentral gyrus is the area number 1, posterior part is area number 2, and anterior part is the area number 3, which is further divided into 3A and 3B. So this is the area number 312 when you read from front to back. That is the postcentral gyrus. Then the precentral gyrus is area number 4. Notice how 1 and behind 1 is the 2, then 3, 4. So it will be going one front, one behind. Then in the superior parietal lobule and in the anterior portion is the area number 5. Now coming back to the frontal lobe, in front of precentral gyrus, extending in the entire length of superior, middle and inferior frontal gyrus, we have area number 6. Now area number 7 is located in the superior parietal lobule, the posterior part. That area is again divided into 7A anteriorly and 7B posteriorly. Then coming back to the frontal lobe again, we have area number 8 in front of area number 6. Then 9, 10, 11 will go along the frontal margin, that is the close to the frontal pole. So we have now started from number 1 and gone all the way to number 11. So at this point we skip a few numbers, start from number 17. Back to the occipital lobe here. The portion which is close to the occipital pole is the area number 17 up to lunate sulcus. Within the depth of lunate sulcus we have area number 18, and the area anterior to the lunate sulcus is the area number 19. Then coming to the temporal lobe, from below upwards, that is inferior, middle and superior temporal gyri have the numbers 20, 21 and 22. At this point we again skip a few numbers. The junction between occipital and the temporal lobe, that is the area number 37. Temporal pole is number 38. Then angular gyrus is number 39. And supramarginal gyrus is Brodmann's area number 40. Now superior surface of the superior temporal gyrus has auditory areas. They are area number 41 and area number 42 around it. Lower end of the postcentral gyrus is area number 43. If you remember when we were talking about the solitary euthalamic tract that is carrying the taste sensation, this is the highest area for that. Then within the inferior frontal gyrus, we had pars triangularis and pars opercularis. Those will be the area numbers 44 and 45. The rest of the area in between the area number 10 and 45 is area number 46. Lower part is area number 47. We skip a few more numbers and the rest of the superior surface of superior temporal gyrus is area number 52. That actually you need not worry about remembering. So these are the various Brodmann areas which we need to remember for understanding the functional areas on the superolateral surface. Now coming to the medial surface, similarly we have area number 312 in the postcentral gyrus area and area number 4 in the precentral gyrus area. These two are found in the paracentral lobule. Area number 5 will be again adjacent to the area number 5 on the superolateral surface. 6 is what we call as supplementary motor area, that is the posterior end of the medial frontal gyrus. Now the rest of the medial frontal gyrus will be numbered as 8, 9, 10 and 11. Area number 7, again A and B part, will be in the precuneus portion. Now around the calcarine sulcus, including the depth of the calcarine sulcus, we have area number 17. See how the arrangement is different here compared to superolateral sulcus. On the superolateral surface, superolateral surface 17, 18 and 19 were arranged from posterior to anterior end. Here the 17 is arranged into the depth as well as above and below the calcarine sulcus. 18 again is arranged above and below the area number 17. 19 again will be arranged above and below the area number 18. Now these are the numbers which you need to remember. The rest I am showing, but you need not worry about memorizing that. So we do have area number 20 in the lateral occipitotemporal gyrus, or otherwise known as fusiform gyrus. Then we have got 23, 24, 25 in cingulate gyrus, 26 in cingulate gyrus, 27, 28 and 29 in the parahippocampal gyrus, 30 in the isthmus region, 31 the lower part of the precuneus, 32 again the upper portion of the cingulate gyrus, 33 anterior portion of the cingulate gyrus, 34 at the uncus, 35 lateral part of the parahippocampal gyrus, 36 and 37 in these regions, that is medial and lateral occipitotemporal gyrus. 38 of course is the temporal pole. So these numbers I have shown you, except 38 which is temporal pole, the rest of the areas you need not remember. Cingulate gyrus has got 6 different Brodmann areas marked on it. So thank you very much. Do learn the various sulci and gyri on all the 3 surfaces. You can visit this site for other neuroanatomy videos.